Welcome to the Yoga Therapy Hour podcast with Amy Wheeler. I've had the good fortune to travel the world learning about yoga therapy on a global scale, and I've been able to meet many of the leaders in the field along the way. I want to share with you what I'm learning as I interview our colleagues from around the world. My hope is that together we can reduce suffering of all sentient beings through our work as yoga teachers and yoga therapists. I would like to welcome Priya Verma to this very important conversation that I think we're about to have. You and I have become friends and colleagues. You're one of the faculty in our yoga therapy program, and I hope to continue to expand your role as you will allow me more time with you. But we actually have gone through some hard stuff together in terms of cultural appropriation, trying to make sure that in our yoga therapy program, we are walking our talk in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. You and I have worked together with the IAYT DEI committee and really trying to push IAYT forward, or be with IAYT as they push forward into the new way of being that I think you and I both felt when we started the work with IAYT, the International Association of Yoga Therapists. They were slow getting to the race. And I think you played a huge role coming in, taking charge, even though you didn't have time and energy and your family probably had to suffer and your job had to suffer. You just decided that you were going to have those hard conversations. You got the town halls started at IAYT. You led them. You made the PowerPoints. I mean, it was impressive to see you just decide to take a hold of that. Just to acknowledge that even having this conversation is difficult. And I don't know about you, Priya, but I kind of was a little bit stressed out about it this week because I don't think you and I have the answers. We're just asking questions. And I think we agreed to just have a conversation in front of our listeners and see what comes out. We don't even really have a huge plan. So welcome, Priya. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for braving this conversation with me, right? I mean, we talk about courageous conversations and some of our DEI work, and that's really what we're doing, right? Just doing the work to show up and talking, and maybe an uncomfortable space. So,
and this is where the yoga begins, right? This is the yamas. This is the ahimsa, the satyam, the having these difficult conversations while doing our best not to harm ourselves or others. Right? This is where the rubber meets the road.
Right? I mean, yoga is a relationship. And if our relationships are disharmonious and we have conflict in them, then we're miserable. It doesn't matter how great our health may be. We'll feel awful. So let's kind of pull at some of these threads that have been unraveling, these things that have sort of barely kept us intact, but have been really stretched with the pandemic, with what's happening with race-related issues all over the world, with climate change. I mean, there's so many aspects of conversations where there is not a homogeneous agreement as to what's happening, right?
I think that's an understatement. Homogeneous agreement, no.
Any of these moments of exchanges and conversations comes because we've got people like you and people in the organization who want to have that conversation. They're willing to sit down and listen and engage in compassion, in active compassion. So when you're in an organization where people are moved in that direction, it makes it easier to start that conversation and to share and facilitate that. So thank you so much for pulling me in. I mean, I never would have thought I would have gotten involved in IAYT. And I remember you telling me, hey, why don't you get involved in DEI? This would be really interesting for you. I'm like, DEI? I mean, I don't really have that strong background. I didn't recognize that there was a voice that I wanted to express that I didn't think anyone wanted to hear. So
I wanted to hear it.
Evidently everyone got a chance for that, right? So that was amazing. And
that's fascinating because now, like, your whole career could take off in that direction. I didn't really understand until this moment that you didn't already have that in your mind before I tried to pull you over in that direction.
Well, it's one of those things. I think we all experience conflict at different levels in our life. We learn how to process them, make adjustments, learn how to articulate our stories, right? I mean, we're storytelling. That's what we do. People want to hear our stories. People want to be heard with their stories. And so learning how to allow for my story to come forward and to see how my story could serve and help others was really powerful, right? I mean, the experiences of being a South Asian woman and being in a yoga space where it's predominantly not South Asian here in the US.
You can say it, white ladies. It's not a bad word.
The Western mindset, if you will, pulling in Eastern aspect and it being an international organization, it was powerful. The first sitar I went to a couple of years ago, it was a mixed bag. It was overwhelming to see 800 people, all there as yoga therapists celebrating the things that my life is based on, and all at once feeling so gaslit because only 10 people in that entire group was South Asian. And each of us had this sort of like deer in headlights look, like what at once there's this sort of acknowledgement that yes, yoga is legit. It's not some sort of, othering type of philosophical way of being. But then to be excluded from that space was it was painful. So yeah, to step into an organization about that and talk about what these experiences are, not just for me, but for so many who have identities that have places with which they have not felt seen and heard and belong, moves me. I think it moves us all.
It's interesting because as someone who's in kind of the entitled place, I think a lot of us don't even realize that entitlement. I know I didn't. And once I realized it and I heard from people like you that how excluded you felt, and then as president, I kind of said, wait a minute, we need to make a big turn here. People started calling me up, South Asians, people of color from all over the world, people who are trans, people who were, I can't even explain all the different types of people that called me and said, I feel excluded, I feel excluded, I feel excluded. And it became like a goal of mine before I left to try to get that ball rolling. And then, of course, Alyssa Worstrel, our new executive director, has just put the nail, she has just got it going on. And then people like you. So anyway, I just wanted to acknowledge the work that you've done, all for free, volunteering, and really have made a profound difference. And I think one of the areas that I've seen you just blossom so beautifully is this idea of having satyam, of having difficult conversations, of addressing the elephant in the room in a way that people can actually hear it. Because that, on one hand, we don't want to be too gentle and not get the point across. But on the other hand, this stuff needs to be heard. Right. So what do you think?
So it's an interesting thing how you framed it that way, because my work has so much been about listening, speaking, advising, counseling, guiding, holding space in medicine. I mean, I can't separate being a yoga therapist and being a physician assistant, right? Like these roles have been so interwoven in how I show up in these healing spaces. And so much of it is listening to what may be a cause of suffering, whether it's a physical complaint or for my client, maybe some other issue, right? And then in terms of understanding that cause of suffering, orienting the conversation towards empowerment and towards healing and wellness, regardless of what the end result is the ultimate goal of health and well-being. So I've been navigating these hard conversations from the beginning. Even when I have patients that would show up in the very beginning of my career, no one really knew what a PA was to begin with. So evidently, Amy, I like to use and go into careers that no one knows anything about, right? And then build myself up in this sort of pioneer role. So in the beginning, I'd have to explain what a physician assistant is and what my competencies were and what was my scope of practice, what we could do. And it's not too different from the conversations that we have now as a yoga therapist, right? Like, This is what we can do. This is how we can work this conversation. And then from there, establishing a place of trust, building a relationship with not just my patients, but my clients and anyone involved in these healing spaces. And then learning to understand that there's universal needs that we all have, but the strategies of how we meet those needs are going to be different. Learning to respect that, understand that, and then offer guidance with what other paths may be there is ultimately what we do in this container. At least that's how I see it, as not just as a PA, but as a yoga therapist.
Well, that's such an interesting, I don't know if you'd call it a correlation between PA, physician assistant, and yoga therapist, because the way medicine is moving, 20 years ago, nobody knew what a PA was, but now within the medical world, it's almost like PAs are popping up everywhere, and they're the ones that do the lion's share of the work, and the physician just kind of oversees everything. So in 20 years, we saw this career just explode, and hopefully the same will be true for yoga therapy.
I think so. I think it's about evolution in conversation and meeting a need. And the need right now is how to have agency in our health and our well-being, and how much more that has been spotlit, obviously, with the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So, but what's been different, Amy, in the last year and a half is, honestly, I went from being a health provider to literally feeling like I'm at war. I've been at war on two separate fronts, not only in being a frontline worker, working in the hospital setting with patients who have COVID, but also dealing with what's called the infodemic, right? This overwhelming amount of information and disinformation that's circulating that makes it so difficult to provide space for truth and for guidance for people to make decisions. My goal has never been to make decisions for my patients. Everything is about what's called an informed consent. We do that as yoga therapists, we do that as healthcare providers. And so the onus is on us to explain what doesn't seem understanding. I don't expect people to understand how the immune system works. It's very complex and complicated. I can give a 30-second crash course on how the immune system works and when it's dysregulated, what's happening and what are our choices.
But can you do that for us now?
Yeah, we can do that. Let's do that.
We're talking about difficult conversations, but we're also talking about COVID-19 and how to move forward as a yoga community, but also how to move forward as humanity. And correct. I think having a 30-second crash course on how our immune system works is an important conversation to have. So go for it.
So, immune system 101. Your immune system is your military defense system. It safeguards the outside world from the inside inner sanctum of our body. So we have these, as I call it, the military branches of our immune system: the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force, right? So our respiratory system is lined with our immune defense system because it's where we interface to receive air, where we take in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. So we've got to have a defense system laid there. Our GI system is an immune system. It's also laid with our ability to interface the outer world of food and nutrition and nourishment that we take in and that we relieve. Then we have our skin, which obviously maintains our homeostasis, our physiology. So it's, of course, lined with their military defense system. And then the fourth most important military part of our defense system is our brain. And not just our specific brain, but our mind and the way we think and how we function. There has to be an execution and oversight of how all these things work. So if any one part of your immune system is triggered, it's going to send a cascade of messages everywhere else. For instance, someone who has a very overzealous immune system, what we call a hyper-responsive immune system, can develop a food allergy, where all of a sudden the system looks at something like peanut and thinks it's a virus or a bacteria. So it mounts a huge immune response to the peanut that comes into the GI system, into the mouth. And then the respiratory system is cued, oh my gosh, there is something that's crossing the defense system. So we may have what's called anaphylaxis or an allergic reaction. So there's this careful symphony of exchange of information that happens. That's why some people break out in rashes from eating something, even though you didn't put it on your skin. or why someone would have this difficulty breathing because of an allergic reaction. That's a function of a hyper-responsive immune system. So our immune systems, our playbook for our immune system is the more our immune system study, organize, train, the more it knows how to respond to things that come in. That's why as we grow up, we have these vaccinations, we have these things to help prime our body in terms of the fight. Now, our immune system has these soldiers that come into response. They're the ones that are at the front gate that interface with what comes in. So if there is a virus or a bacteria that's already been recognized in the playbook, we already know what to do. We have to recognize this, we need to lock it down, we need to put it away. So that's what a functioning immune system does. Many ways to get there. Either we learn what this potential foe would be by bringing it in and recognizing it's going to cause havoc, and either the havoc is going to be mild or the havoc is going to be pretty bad.
And so by that, sorry to interrupt, but you mean like we get COVID and then our body kind of builds those antibodies and understands it a little bit. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's true for everything, every virus. I mean, we live in balance with an environment where we're constantly being exposed to outer elements. In fact, our own DNA, if we were to reduce our own DNA down of our own body, only 70% of us is our own DNA. The remaining 30% is made up of DNA of the microbiome that lives within our GI system, within our genitourinary system, within our respiratory system, within our mouth, right? So we live in this balance with organisms, right? But again, it's part of this balance or homeostasis that we think about in yoga therapy. Same thing applies in the system. When the balance is offset, it's very hard to maintain well and do things. So when we're talking about COVID, we're talking about the havoc that happens with a new virus that comes in that your body has been primed to see. And the problem is that it's the aftermath, it's the fighting and the mucking up of that interplay of it coming in that makes people who are otherwise very healthy very sick. And when we have such a large number of people sickened, we have limited resources to take care of them. So that was why in the beginning of the pandemic, we were trying to ramp things down because the numbers were going up, hospitals were full, and if more and more people got sick, we were having to ration care. And so that's kind of been the iteration of what's happening on the hospital front. And unfortunately, yet again, is happening even here in my local hospitals in Georgia and in many places around the country as we see the Delta variant going.
And that just happened to my dad. He had a major health issue come up, and he sat in an emergency room for 20 hours without getting care, and then got sent home and told to come back 72 hours later to actually get the tests he needed. And it was a very significant health issue. So imagine an 80-year-old man sitting there for 20 hours and then, sorry, we still can't find a bed for you, go home. I was so upset about that. And, you know, I understand, and I'm sure we'll get into this idea of medical sovereignty and not wanting to put the vaccination in one's body. I do understand and empathize with that, and had a 4-hour discussion with my hairdresser the other day about it. Like, I get that. And we are all connected. It's not just about me.
Right.
So I don't know if you even want to go there, but.
Oh yeah, we're going there. I mean, that's really honestly what this has been all about, is that, so that's where we look at difficult conversations. We'll lens that difficult conversations just from really answering to this specifically, right? Because COVID is really the number one thing that we're all talking about. And so, like I said, I'm dealing with warring on both fighting for the care of people who have COVID and all the medical problems and the consumption of healthcare resources right now, and not having enough people to provide these resources, let alone the ones who are now burned and leaving.
Right. And quitting.
And then we have the infodemic, where we have, it's so unbelievable. I mean, it's a wonderful gift that we have so much information, but when there's disinformation that's put out there, when there is stigmatized information that's placed out there that's not vetted out, the amount of harm that comes from calling this the China virus and it stigmatizing and causing harm to our Asian communities is irreprehensible.
Yep.
Because that's not what this is, right?
Right.
When we have poorly vetted resources on entertainment news channels that are being shared that are not sound medical care, in for me, it's like people are practicing medicine, talking about what you should take and what you shouldn't take, and they don't know the first thing about what I just shared with how the immune system works. So are they culpable and accountable and responsible for giving bad medical advice? No, but I am. I have to carry a medical malpractice for anything I say. So I'm responsible for vetting out anything that I share. That's my scope of practice, right? So, this infodemic is partly, I think, a deeper issue that we have, and it's been going on for a long time in medicine, is that we have attachments in how we want to see the world. And many of us live in echo chambers. We listen to the same people that say the same things that we want to hear. So we get very comfortable in looking at things from one lens. And if anything is shifted from that lens, it's very uncomfortable. And we don't identify with that. And in many cases, we may emotionally react from that. So of course, we can take the yoga therapy lens and address what's happening there, which is the root of fear, of not belonging, of not feeling safe, can definitely be expressed in wanting to stay in a sort of lens of listening to only a certain group of people who share information. So for me, being in both houses, both in yoga therapy and in a wellness-based model, as well as medicine, I listen. I have dear friends who identify as being anti-vax or vaccine hesitant, as well as friends and colleagues who are very pro-vaccine because of their experience. And so how we enter these conversations and how we talk about it is one to establish a place of safety where I'm not going to judge someone for how they feel, because there's a reason behind, there's a need behind that feel and that need, there's purpose to it. And it's important for me to understand where that's coming from. That's going to orient my conversation a little differently from my client or my colleague calling me about what vaccine, if any, they should pursue, right?
Right.
So lots to unpack when it comes to vaccines. There's a science behind it that I think a lot of people have felt, because the vaccines came on so quickly, that it should be vetted out longer. But I don't think people recognize and understand how long vaccine technology has been around, particularly mRNA. I mean, it's been around since I was in undergrad. My undergrad degree was at Ohio State, go HIO, for probably the one cricket football fan out there. But my undergrad degree was in molecular genetics, and I had this incredible experience watching the O.J. Simpson, white Bronco vehicle going down the expressway, and all the conversation that was talking about the DNA testing at that time, PCR analysis.
That was a while ago.
What I was learning. Yeah, it was a while ago. It was a half second ago. But that's what I was learning, and that's what I was studying. I did research in immunology and published. So this has been an old hat to me for a long time, but it's really subtle and nuanced. It's hard to kind of unpack all that science and make sense of it. But an mRNA is not manipulating your DNA. That's why it came about so quickly. It's readily based science that we've used in very sophisticated applications for real medical problems for 10 years, right? Including immunotherapy and cancer treatment. And we put a lot of money and interest into those cares, right? And we take, our safeguards are extremely high. So yeah, I had work colleagues, people in the healthcare spaces, that were hesitant about vaccines. I don't think there's a problem with being hesitant about something. That means we're taking a pause, we're reflecting, we're looking to see.
I was hesitant.
There. Yeah.
I mean, I was because it's the same thing. I heard this new technology, and has it been tested, and what are we going to learn after we all take this? But then I went and talked to reputable people who know more than I do, who know how to read peer-reviewed journals, who have degrees in molecular biology. I mean, we have to go to trusted sources. And that's not to say science is perfect. Science is an evolving discovery over time, right?
Agreed.
I'm not saying even science is the 100% answer. I mean, we can look back at history to see it's not, right? But go ahead.
But there are vetted sources. When someone breaks their bone, who are they going to go to fix that bone? You're going to go to the person who's trained to fix bones, because you don't want to have it messed up, right? When your car breaks down, it's brand new, something's happened. Do you take it to someone who fixed refrigerators? Not necessarily, right? Like we're going to vet things out. We take such care in vetting out what we're going to purchase in our house, right? But it's so interesting to me that when it comes to the agency of what decisions we make to medicine, we don't necessarily apply that. In fact, majority of people, they get their information for their medical decision makings from their neighbors and their friends, which that's where I talked about echo chambers. When we're in the same sort of mindset, does that add any dimension to what we're taking in? I mean, as yoga therapists, we look at the Yoga Sutras, right? How do we get clarity? We need to seek more robust information. We need to seek people who are knowledgeable, that are trustworthy. And Amy, that's the problem, is that there's a lot of mistrust, and medicine has an obligation towards addressing that. There has been medical harm. There has been this sort of machinery where we are so siloed in medicine in terms of different specialties that when someone has a complaint, something as general as abdominal pain, it could come from so many sources. And, when someone's going through the system, it may take 2 or 3 or 4 people before they finally figure out what's the cause. It can be very frustrating. There's a cost associated with it, and it raises distrust that the system is not serving. And I understand that. But I think on a deeper level, for a lot of communities of color, there has been a history of medical harm, that there has been a lack of informed consent in very flagrant ways and in very subtle ways, hopefully still not in practice in this day and age, but definitely there. So I understand the fear and the distrust of so many. And that's on medicine. I think medicine has to do the job of reconciliation, of understanding where that harm has been. And I think a lot of people that are in medicine now spend the time at the bedside to talk and to listen. And if that's not happening, then you're going to find someone that's going to be willing to talk and listen.
So I just love how you're approaching this, that you are in medicine, you're admitting there has been problems and that reconciliation needs to occur. And it is also our responsibility to not stay in our silos. And it reminds me of this wonderful woman that you and I have been talking about lately, because in our Optimal State Yoga Therapy program, we're totally into what's called nonviolent communication with Marshall Rosenberg. But you have introduced me to Minda. How do you say her name? Menadici?
Menadchi.
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 Menadchi. Thank you. And she has a trauma-informed lens towards nonviolent communication. And what I love about her bio, which it just made me feel happy. She says, 5 years ago, I would describe myself as having been progressively liberal. My politics have vastly radicalized, though how radical they truly are, I don't know. It is the strangeness of advocating for Indigenous sovereignty while maintaining a U.S. passport. And I explore the edges of my practice. I find relationships and belonging are the entry point and access for transformation. So talk to us about this way of communicating with nonviolent communication that kind of transcends politics, transcends the I'm right, you're wrong, I'm smarter, you're not smart enough, do it my way, because if you don't, you're on the outsides. Like, talk to us about this approach.
I think it comes from a spirit, first of all, a way of wanting to approach this. I think if we approach any conversation mad, we're not going to have the lens to be able to see through that conversation. If we come into a conversation emotionally triggered, it's hard to remain as an active listener. So I think to engage in nonviolent communication, some of it is doing the work of recognizing and having compassion for the state that we're in, not to judge it, but to recognize where we ourselves are at. I love the work that has been done with Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversation, because he puts nonviolent communication in action when we're talking about conversations, right? Nonviolent communication, particularly in Menadchi's application, takes a more cultural, nuanced way of doing it, especially because when a group of people do not experience the same ability of being seen and heard, nonviolent communication doesn't resonate the same way because there is privilege that's involved in being able to be seen and heard. So I love her way of articulating that and pulling the universal root of understanding that we all have needs, but our strategies are different. And it's not to take away or remove the compassion for understanding that, but recognizing there is a difference. So I think that's a fundamental gift that comes from nonviolent communication, especially as she's articulated it, right?
So let's take this, sometimes we keep it so intellectual, but let's look at a real deal. Like, I've got a yoga therapy school, and I have students who are anti-vax, anti-mask, and asking me when we're going to come back in person. And on Facebook, I see them running all over the place, 20, 30, 40 people at their house, no masks. I assume, since they told me they're anti-vax, Right. And then I'm feeling this push of, oh, do we need to reopen live? So in NVC, I would be looking at that person's needs for community, for ease, for connection, and really trying to understand what's underneath that request. And then I've got me over here who also has a need for safety for our faculty and our students, a need for honoring the people who maybe don't have super strong immune systems, and knowing that if I put them in that situation, they might have to quit the program, right? And so I'm taking into consideration both sets of needs. And then I have other people in the program that are so pro-vaccine and really want to be heard and seen around their pro-vaccine. And so what nonviolent communication is saying, look, what are our common needs? What are the needs that are different for all of us? And are there strategies we can use to get our needs met? Not your needs, not my needs, but creative strategies to get our needs met.
I love that, because at the core of that, it's recognizing and acknowledging I have needs and acknowledging you have needs. And at the heart of that is having courage to be compassionate for those differences in those needs, right? So when we operate from this place of understanding, people who are, say, for your example, for those who choose to not wear masks and not to be vaccinated, their lens, how they are viewing it, is very different. Their threat of safety is very different than someone who feels that the mask and vaccines are essential to their felt place of safety. So when the conditions of safety are not met, then it's very hard to have connection. So establishing a co-negotiated process where both parties understand what that requirement is essentially how we're moving forward through this pandemic. Now, that means personal accountability, and that means reliability. So there has to be an inherent basis of trust in some level to come into community. So for someone who is not vaccinated, there is an onus of requirement to protect those around you.
Or at least to consider their needs.
Well, yeah, I mean, the issue though is that when there's an infection that you can carry that you may not have symptoms of, you could be the agent for transmission of harm to someone else. And it's not taking the politics or anything else. This is essentially what's happening. This is what we're seeing in our schools that have opened back up, that there is spread. In my community here, they are not mandating masks. The schools don't have masks. My daughter's high school has the highest COVID count in the county. It's a smaller school with a little more overpopulation. So there's just a lot more ability to spread this, right? Does that mean everyone is sickened in the hospital? No. But that does mean that those who carry that virus, whether asymptomatic or symptomatic, may be bringing it home to a loved one that could be very vulnerable. So we have then this recognition that it's not just me, there's someone else, right? That's the essential part of NVC. It's not just me, it's us. So when we think of us in that frame, then we have to consider the burdens of safety for us, right?
And I think that's so critical in a yoga context. I was studying with my teachers at Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandram, and, especially Patanjali's Yoga Sutra can almost seem selfish. It's about me and my mind and my sattva and all of that. But what Nrithya was explaining to us, and I think you were on this call too, is that there's an assumption that we're all in this together, that we've got each other's back, that we care about one another, that we want to be helping one another. The assumption of I, me, mine is, I'm going to take care of me. I have sovereignty to do whatever I want for me and not care about how it affects everybody else. That is not a yogic deal. That the assumption is that we are a community of care and that we do want to be in connection with each other and take care of one another. Even if we can't agree on the strategies, at least we acknowledge that it's not just all about I, me, and mine.
I have this new x-ray tech that's training with us, and we were talking about sterile technique, right? And in terms of teaching sterile technique, the idea of keeping a place so clean that we can reduce harm within that space when we do a procedure, right? So in terms of making it so intuitive and a felt experiential way of understanding sterile technique, we were talking about what it's like when anything that's not sterile comes into the field, right? And it made me think, the easiest thing to say was like, imagine, think of anything that's not in that sterile field like the public bathroom. It's probably suspect. It's probably not clean. There's a lot of shared overuse in there. There's a lot of germs in that place, right? So think of anything outside of that sterile field as potential poo, right? So we don't want anything to touch that field. We want to maintain our conduct and our behavior in such a way that we keep everything as clean as possible. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with what it's like to use a public bathroom. We use discrimination. We use our awareness. And I hope we all wash our hands so that we're not bringing illness to ourselves or to others. But that's very much the practice of what we're talking about when we're talking of shared spaces in this way when it's COVID, because it is possible that even though you may not touch your face after use of the hand, if that hand is not washed, that can be the bearer of harm to someone else. And we certainly wouldn't want to experience the tail end of food served at the hands of someone who has not cleansed their hands. That's how hepatitis and so many other infections happen, right? So this is not radical new science. This is just practical hygiene, right? Hygiene for ourselves and for others. So this is not a far-fetched notion to consider others. But again, the misinformation, the echo chambers, the stigma, the actual misdirection of information get so caught up that when we come from a place being triggered, feeling our sovereignty is being taken away, when dictated to rules as to how we should function, it's real easy to listen to those voices versus listening to the practical things that make sense to our day-to-day way of living. And I would ask this, when we're talking about sattva and people who they're coming from a place of calm and an informed place of balance, are we taking our information sources from similar-minded people, or are they triggered? Because if you're going to someone who's very opinionated, wants to be right versus being in a relationship, are they lensing the information the same way that's going to make sense and benefit you? Maybe, but probably not.
Oh, I got so triggered today on a Facebook conversation. I thought, this is not where I want to put my mind. I don't want to be triggered. I don't want to associate with people who are out there to trigger. Like, it's just not going. If our goal is connection and understanding and wanting to hear one another and having difficult conversations so that we can maybe come to some shared understanding, it ain't happening in those circles on Facebook when people are just yelling at each other and going off. This is an intimate thing to connect with one another.
It is. And I think that's part of it, is that for those who come into feeling more comfortable on digital platforms, because it is a place of connection that they wouldn't otherwise have. And so it's safeguarded, and it has more strength and power. Their potency is more powerful. And boy, oh boy, do these guys know that. So there's so much manipulation. There's what's called bots that manipulate the information that's put out there. I mean, in terms of unraveling some of the medical stuff that shifted out there, a lot of the misinformation that was put out there was generated and really accentuated in terms of how many times wrong articles or poor advice was downloaded, was shared. I mean, we have these metrics now to see what happens on Facebook, on Twitter, and some other platforms, which is, I think, why some of those platforms chose to start looking at vetting out any posts affiliated with COVID-19 or other things, right? And a lot of people got upset about that because of the freedom of speech. But all freedoms bear responsibility. All freedoms do. Our freedom to speak also means that there's a consequence of harm from that speak, right? And that freedom to bear arms can be that there could be harm related to that. Our freedom to practice our faith of our choice, that comes with we always have responsibility in that space. And so that means accountability to some extent. So circling back to talking about people who choose not to wear masks and people who choose not to use vaccines, I respect that. But I also then acknowledge the person who chooses to conduct themselves that way must also acknowledge that they, one, can get COVID, two, that they can pass it to someone, and three, that they can create a different strain that can leave all of us vulnerable. And if that's acknowledged and understood, and their conduct meets that acknowledgement and that need then furthers potential harm, then there's accountability to that. And that's what's happening in corporate places where hospitals are mandating that you take a vaccine because of the potential harm for their patients, or in university settings and so forth, right?
Yeah, we just got the letter yesterday saying as of September 20th, either provide your proof of vaccination or you will no longer work here, right? And I have good friends that are just so upset. They've been working for the university for a long, long time and having to make really tough decisions. And I guess that's where this conversation is leading. You know, we all have family members, loved ones, faculty, students that have different viewpoints, different values, different needs than us. And I know you have been getting people calling you off the hook, even from my program, to have these conversations. And so what I hear you saying is that you are acknowledging their deepest needs. And you're also saying it is your choice in most cases, but there are responsibilities that go with that. There are consequences to that. There is karma with one choice versus another. I mean, both probably have karma associated with it, but as long as you're conscious and clear that that's what you've decided, then I guess we've had the conversation we need to have. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. And I think I'm also going to acknowledge a bit more. I'm going to acknowledge that I think there's a lot of trauma and need and fear that's at the base of all of that we're engaging. This is a fear-based model, right? And when we're talking about fear, we're talking about how people then will react in a way where they feel that they're being blindsided or attacked when a conversation gets engaged. It's the emotional triggering of feeling that they need to safeguard because they are under threat. Conversations have to be modulated in a way that we try to seek a common ground of safety. But that's difficult for people if they're in that emotional space. It's not a time to be right. It's not a time to promote vaccine efficiency. It's the time to say, tell me more. Let me understand more. Let's explore that and understand that. Because that's essentially what an informed decision is. It's not mine to make over anybody's choice of their body. Sovereignty is making choice. It has nothing to do with who tells you what you can and cannot do. Sovereignty is the ability to choose of our own accord. We've been granted that with free will. So I think it sometimes gets muddled in a larger system, but I remember these conversations when seatbelts were placed in cars. Now, I grew up where we didn't have seatbelts, and oh my gosh,
or speed limits.
People lost their mind being pulled over for a seatbelt check. We still sometimes have those seatbelt checks in different areas, but why was it placed? To save lives. And it took 10 years as a public health strategy to get people to finally acquiesce. And honestly, it took the car manufacturers finally placing seatbelts almost on that automatic thing where you'd get into the car and the seatbelt would just fold over your shoulder and then, it would get stuck or fit in such a way. So it took some nuance to try to figure it out, right? but it was a 10-year battle. The problem now is that 10 years of COVID probably is not what anybody wants.
Well,
I'm guessing.
according to my doctor, who's a Western medical trained doctor as well as an Ayurvedic doctor, she says 10 years minimum. She said, Amy, plan your new life, plan your yoga therapy school, knowing this. And so I, for one, after listening to all sorts of students, and I don't consider it political at all, because I've got students way left and way right that are vaccine hesitant, anti-vax. And I have a lot of people somewhere in the middle. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to a lot of this. After listening to everyone, what I've decided in order to try to keep everyone safe is to stay online as long as IAYT will let us. That is after looking at everybody's needs. And I guess there will be people who will say, well, I'm not going to that yoga therapy school. And there'll be other people that will say, I want to go to that yoga therapy school because it's online, the ease, less money for travel, and safety around COVID. But I just want to say that the way forward is to listen, to hear, to understand a lot of different people's needs before we make our decisions. And there will be people that are mad about our decision, but that's the consequence of each of the people in the game or in the conversation making their decision. There's dominoes that happen.
Well, I mean, that's really the function of what we talk about when we unpack the sutras, when we talk about obstacles or the kleshas, right? That depending on where you make your decision, I hope the decisions are made with as minimal obstacles as possible. And are you really seeing things as they are, or do you have some wrong understanding? Was the information that you were given to govern that decision for staying in a program or staying in a relationship with someone based on misinformation? Because how much that happens and how much regret we come to learn when we've been misinformed about something. It's awful. And having a sort of egotistical, more egocentric way, prove me I'm wrong, show me the evidence, or my research is showing this way of seeing things without looking at the potential blind spots or the unconscious beliefs and ideas that may be there in terms of our knowledge, and having a very self-facing way of looking at things versus outward-facing can really narrow and increase that suffering, right? I mean, this is clear 101 Yoga Sutras, right?
Yep.
When we look at aversions, right? This I have to have this certain way of living, and anything that's about that I can't have. That bypassing around that, whether it's aversions or whether it's sort of a desire, whether it's whatever mode of lifestyle you have, can also produce harm because it impacts others, right? And then, of course, it's this defensiveness. If we're defensive about something, then how much truth does that truth hold up to it? Because it seems to me truth usually holds up regardless of your emotional stand. The sun's going to rise, the moon is there, we have day and night, there's set things, we know those things will be there, they hold true. But if we have to be so emotional, the sun's not going to rise, the moon's not going to rise, then perhaps what we're holding on to is not as true. And maybe we need to explore, what are we attached to?
Yeah.
Why do we need to be right about something and not be in relationships? That's where the yoga really comes in to unpacking all of that. And it takes a conversation, a willingness to kind of sit and understand if we're intellectualizing, are we being emotional, are we looking at our social visibility of being a yoga wellness provider, and that yoga can heal. Absolutely true, but you know what? Yoga doesn't heal infections. It can boost your immune system, but it won't fight the infection once it's there. It just doesn't do that. I wish it would. And I think I would love to see more research that shows that and share those ideas. That's what Ayurveda, and that's what homeopathy, and that's what medicine has. It offers the tools for the disease model, not the wellness model that yoga is so beautifully articulated in. And I think there's a little bit of hubris maybe that, very healthy, very young, very fit, work out. There's a little bit of ableism built into it. Well, I don't have any medical conditions and I should be fine when I get COVID. And nothing could be farther from the truth. I mean, most of the people that I'm seeing in the hospital now are young and they don't have medical problems. Back in December, when I got COVID, between my first and second vaccine, there was a 21-year-old that came into the hospital and 5 days later was dead. Had no medical problems. It was terrifying to see that this virus really didn't care about the ableist way of being, health, fitness, body fat percentage, ability, non-smoking, vegetarian lifestyle. None of that mattered. None of that mattered. So
that's really interesting to me. I mean, as a physician's assistant, how do you explain that? And then you have someone who really has high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, maybe is obese, like all the things that COVID should be seen. I mean, what we have seen is that those are not good risk factors, but that person is actually makes it out and is okay. Like, it's
right.
kind of baffling. Do you think it's genetics? Do you think, how do you see that?
So obviously, the sicker you are, the older you are, the frail you are, the less your physical form is going to be resilient in face of stress, right? But the stress can be so overwhelming because the underlying trigger may be a part of your genetic blueprint. It could be just the viral load that you received. It could be that your immune system was a little depressed at the time. There's so many factors that I think 10 years from now, we'll be digging and looking at all of this as what were the indicators. But like most viruses don't care. They're very simple organisms. They have a very small structure. All they care about is surviving, and that's all they have to do. They will keep changing and adapting to keep growing. And so the viruses can get smarter. They can get dumber, but they can also get smarter, which is kind of what happened with Delta. It got more contagious, more easy to share. When we look at R naught, that's the number of, how quickly something can spread. Or the first initial strain that came out was an R naught of 2, right? Meaning it's like 10-fold more likely to infect the people around you. The current Delta strain is 6. So that's.
And what about Mu? Have you heard about Mu?
Yeah, I haven't dug too much at that thread because honestly, I've been so overwhelmed with what we've had in our hospitals now. It's too depressing.
Yeah.
The data's coming in, I'm looking at it, it's my responsibility. But, most of us on the front lines we're so burnt.
Yeah.
It's just for those of us who serve communities who've been on the front line, keep in mind, everyone in the hospital, we have families. We have to come home and bring the warfare to our children and to our parents. And that harm affects us while we serve, we take the harm. And I'm not a military soldier. God bless those who serve. That's not what I chose. And to bring that burden home until I'd been vaccinated and until my family was vaccinated was absolutely overwhelming. No one should feel like their job could bring harm and potentially end the life of their loved ones. That's just not.
I remember you telling me how you would come home, strip all your work clothes off in the garage, do a huge decontamination, and then go in the house. I mean, I don't know if people understand how hard you all are working, and that even people who decide against vaccines, when they show up, you're going to be the face that's going to be compassionately helping them.
Well, so that's interesting because a lot of folks most of the patients that are in our hospital that have COVID are unvaccinated, 94%, right? And so many are asking, well, can I get the vaccine now? Well, no, you're in live mode now. And now you're having to fight through this without that blueprint that we were talking about, the training the immune system to recognize what this is. And you're going to have to duke it out. And we're going to try to give you what you can, but you're going to have to ride out the storm. And that storm can be awful, right? It could be fatal. And that's the problem. So I think there's a level of hubris out there, which I understand. There's no question if you're younger, yes, statistically, you're going to do well. Is everyone who have a COVID infection going to die? No. But what we are now seeing, what's not really being widely discussed, is the fallout from COVID. There's been a wellness after COVID initiative, but how COVID affects people is so different. It could be as so subtle as fatigue, but the fatigue can be so pronounced that person may not be up to exercising in a way, right? In a way that's cardiovascular fit for me. That certainly has been the case for me. I could not do any sort of high level cardio for 6 months because every time I would run up the stairs, I'd have palpitations. Never had that before. An echocardiogram done a year before I had COVID, totally normal, fit, healthy, right? So that has been some of the fallout that we're seeing. in NCAA Division I athletes, these young men are the fittest of fittest of fittest. They looked at a study of what COVID did to them, and 30% of them had cardiac abnormalities after having an asymptomatic COVID infection. So if you think about it from the revenue perspective, what that could do for these young men that may have potential for professional careers in the NBA, I mean, that's devastating. So there's real consequences.
And is that long term? I mean, do we know?
Well, that's what's interesting is they're looking at, a lot of it is they're looking to see how long that is there. There are chest x-ray changes that can happen that you may not have symptoms of. What I'm seeing a little more in my niche in interventional radiology is some of the neurological stuff that may be coming up. You know, there's so many subtle things where when you shift your homeostasis and it shifts it out of balance, you're going to see different expressions. And that is what we need to pay attention to. Not just the debilitating aspect of long-term COVID, but also the consequences of having had the infection, increasing your risk for having cardiovascular issues, stroke, cancer, all the other things that are deep cemented changes within our physical body that yoga may not be able to necessarily change and revert back, but help through. You know, I mean,
I think that's what I'm coming away with is there's so much we don't know. And I think anyone who has arrogance on any side of the argument, you know, we just don't know. We don't know. I mean, to hear that there's people asymptomatic who have long-term issues, that's terrifying. And we don't even know what that's going to look like.
Well, most people don't know how their body is working. We don't know what's under the hood. We walk around and we hang out in our head, and then we get upset when our body's out of balance. The knee starts hurting or the back starts hurting because we function, relatively speaking, disembodied. Yeah. We're so in our heads. So these medical processes, these imbalances, these then disease states that emerge are a reflection of that disembodiment. And so taking a virus or illness or anything that happens in there to disrupt that imbalance even more can have long-term consequences, not just COVID, you know? So yeah, I mean, it has been my job, it has been my privilege, it has been my duty and my dharma to serve and to educate and to teach and to never judge. But I will say it's been harder to hold that compassionate space for those who would choose to put myself, my coworkers in harm's way and ignore what are actual boundaries of safety. That's not acceptable. I've had people come in with COVID symptoms, unmasked, not say anything, get past the screening because they misrepresent themselves, and then they have symptoms because they want care. I mean, that's happened. That's just, you know, that puts everyone in harm's way. That's not a reasonable way of going about. Like, we have to have some integrity in how we go about doing things. So yeah, for a responsibility for everyone, my responsibility is to not judge, but my job is also to ensure safety for all of us, just like you're holding safety.
That's right.
For a virtual program. And yeah, it stinks. I miss connection. I miss tackle hugging all of our students and
I miss making chai with you.
Oh my God, the chai and the khichdi and all this wonderfulness. But, you know, we can do that in spaces where everyone agrees upon the conditions of safety. But when you don't, you can't have it.
That's how I feel. It was a very, very hard decision for me because if we have this beautiful retreat center. And I mean, that is that connection with other like-minded people for 9 days is a really beautiful thing. And at this point, we are not agreeing on safety. And therefore, this is the consequence.
I mean, there's heartbreak in it. I had to close my brick and mortar yoga therapy studio, my office down, because I take care of COVID patients every day. So I could potentially bring harm to my students. And there was no way I was going to endanger my clients. And quite honestly, for a while, as I was trying to work through my trauma response, I could not understand why so many yoga teachers were continuing to teach, not knowing that they could potentially pass harm to their students. I mean, it's an essential prefect of what we do as yoga teachers, as yoga therapists, and as practicing yoga practitioners, right? We essentially have to understand what that harm means. And yeah, it means it stinks. It's heartbreaking. It broke my heart to close that space down. It was 3 years in the making. It was exquisite, and it was 100% the right thing to do.
Well, and that's just it. I mean, the first yama is non-harming, ahimsa, right?
And I get connection. I understand the mental well-being fabric that we are built on. But if the conditions of safety are not met, we cannot meet transformation. We cannot meet relationship.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. And so we all have to ask that question when we engage in our decisions. If you're not feeling good, you probably shouldn't be walking out without a mask. If you're having a fever, you're having any symptoms, don't assume that you have some allergies or something else. You should be tested, because you are not a good judge. We are not COVID, checkers, right? And we shouldn't be news and everything else. There are resources that are available to allow for that checking. And then I will say this, there's this element that I want to speak to, that we don't have access to care well in this country. I can only speak here in the US about that. And that there are people that can't afford to maybe take a vaccine, because we do know there's going to be an immune effect. You're going to feel lousy. And to take a day off is not possible for a lot of people, right? They may not be able to take the day off during work, or their work may not allow it, or their work hours may not be conducive to being able to go to a local place to get those vaccines. Those are hard stops, and we need to work as communities to make those resources available for those who don't have that. I mean, there's lots of aspects to this conversation that we have to address. I will speak to that. I think there's an important part of accessibility that has to be acknowledged and named.
There's a beautiful woman in San Francisco that recognized exactly what you're talking about. And she just goes one by one around the neighborhood and says, how can I help you? How can I support you if you want to get vaccinated? She has helped 1,274 people get vaccinated through just an acts of service. Like, can I drive you? Can I'm so touched by that she would take her time and energy to have conversations with people in a non-judgmental way, to drive them, to babysit their kids if they need it so they could go do it, go to the doctor. I mean, 1,274 people. That's amazing. And counting. She's still going.
That's amazing. I love that. It's acts of service. It's acts of kindness that is part of the dignity of being in a community. It's who we are. I do believe in that. I do recognize that. I see that all the time. I know when people, especially in our communities, when people are sick, where there's always a string of potlucks and, share a meal plans and strategies. I mean, my community is amazing. We live in the South, and we have both ends of the political spectrum, and the vaccine spectrum and the mask spectrum. And I recognize each and every one of these individuals in my community as human beings, and capable of incredible acts of kindness and compassion, and capable of acts of harm from fear. So I'm just speaking to that. Let's talk about that fear. Let's have that uncomfortable conversation about the root of fear that's there. Let's walk into that conversation together, knowing that you're not alone and I'm not alone, and we'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's the only way forward. This polarizing, attacking, we will go down together on the ship. So we might as well try this other route that you're suggesting.
And I think it's in action too. I think there's more of that going on than not. Obviously, when we look at the data, how many people are vaccinating, how many people are choosing to wear masks, how many people are continuing to not vaccinate, not wear masks, but are social distancing and withdrawing from larger communities. I mean, I think what we've seen some bad, but I think we have to also name and acknowledge how much good behavior, how much selfless acts there have been, and how hard this has been financially for so many people. I mean, this is just devastating. I get it. And I want us all to move forward. I recognize that. I recognize for so many yoga practitioners and studio owners, teachers, and therapists, this has been disabling to not be able to function in that space, because most yoga therapists do have to teach classes, and virtual is not an accessibility option for a lot of our special populations. So how do we serve that? but I think yoga therapists can find a way. We can partner with larger organizations, and there's people that want to show how to help their communities. Partner with them, partner with corporates, partner with community public health places, so that there's a place of community that's safe. I think let's take the obstacle, take the detour that we were meant to follow, take the road less traveled, and see what we were meant to see.
Yeah.
Follow that path. Trust in it.
It's just so much easier to be reactive and polarized and throw tomatoes at each other. I mean, what you're talking about is a lot of time, energy, focus, heart opening, self-reflection, which is what we're supposed to be doing as yogis. Magically.
You mean it's not a handstand? Look, I love the asana too. And maybe that's what we got to do. Maybe our superpowers as yoga therapists is to help each other find ways to get to that place where we can have these conversations and be with each other, even if we can't, because that's just as powerful. Right? I'm with you. And that's, it's so heartwarming to know that both of us have good friends, colleagues, family members that have completely different perspectives. And we're willing to have these hard conversations like we're describing today and still really deeply love one another, even if we 100% disagree. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we all agreed on everything, the echo chambers would be pretty boring. Yeah. We wouldn't have diversity. We wouldn't have a different flavor. We wouldn't have a different way of seeing things that opens our eyes to the magic of what the world is and how we think it is. I mean, that's all about the differences is what makes us stronger. And I think what we're talking about is not a spiritual bypass. It's not like, well, I just have my beliefs. Like everything you described in the first 20 minutes of this, where do you get your information? Are you in an echo chamber? Are you willing to be open to others' perspectives? All of it. That is where the tapas happens, the friction. And that's necessary. We can't just jump to the other side and be like, love and roses and unicorns with no tapas. No self-reflection, no understanding that through our sovereignty, we actually are creating harm to another, right? The whole thing has to happen. Resilience is not about going through unscathed. Resilience is knowing you're going to heal from being hurt and be okay with it and take the microcuts and so forth and understand the paper cut is not going to kill us. It's going to burn a little bit. It's going to hurt. It was received in a way that it wasn't intended. Let's recognize it for what it was, a paper that was handed to us, an argument or a consideration that we may not agree with, and it cut in the wrong way. But we can let that heal over, and we can see where that was coming from. Was it intentional, or was it kind of offered as reactive? So we need to be able to see where that harm is coming from and look with greater clarity and compassion for ourselves too. I mean, this work is hard, man. That's why we got to have our yoga practice in the morning. Got to have it. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And cut down on the caffeine, everybody. I find when I have caffeine, I get so revved up, and then I can just start spinning off into judgment and polarization and triggering, and it's horrible. But that's great, Amy, because that's the thing. We all do it, right? Like I'm not the Sattvic queen. I mean, the idea is to get there and know when we're way out of balance, what we need to do to course correct to kind of get back there, right? I mean, I had to give up caffeine 4 years ago. I can't have it. And sadly, I've discovered chocolate is not my friend either, because it does pick up my gunas into more pitta. And I had to be careful because, boy, we all like being right, don't we? Oh, yeah. It feels good to be right. But it feels worse when we're not in relationships. It's always just recognizing that polarity. I'm like, well, so I don't believe the same thing that this person does, but I really like that person. So I'm willing to hold space. Well, let us leave it at that. I think that's a beautiful last thought. And I know you worked a full day before you came and jumped on here to have this pretty refined conversation, which takes a lot of attention and focus. And I'm just so grateful that you brought this perspective as a physician's assistant and a yoga therapist to help us learn more about our choices, our communication, and basically decide, do you want to be right or do you want to be in relationship? Love that. That's a great recap.
All right. Thank you so much, Priya. Oh,
Thank you,
before we
Amy.
go, we need to know how we can be in touch with you. What are you doing? What is your website? What are you passionate about that you want to share with us?
Oh, goodness. So much going on. So, one, a plug for IYT. Like I said, the stepping into the organization, which like I shared, it was hard to kind of be in the symposium, but the friendships, the professional relationships that I've built with just working in the town hall and now the task force has been unbelievable. It's so amazing to connect with other yoga therapists and other yoga teachers and explore the space because everyone comes from that same love of yoga. So plug for that because it's been really transformational for me.
And that's the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Belonging Task Force.
Correct. And we always are looking for volunteers to come in and step in to have these conversations. Most of the yoga happens in the preparation of some of these town halls and just holding space and listening to languaging and how we call in and support and being constructive. So one plug for IYT because it's been a godsend through this last year and a half. As far as reaching me, I have a website and I have a digital card that you can download. Text Yoga RX to 21,000 and it will link my business card to your cell phone and you can download and save it.
Put in the text Yoga RX 21,000 right. And your stuff will pop up.
Correct. 21,000. Text to the number 21,000 and put Yoga RX and you'll get a link to my digital business card. So it saves straight to your phone.
So instead of the phone number, you put in 21,000. Wow, how cool.
Yep, it's so cool. New technology. We had to get COVID friendly, right? Like digital virtual friendly. So I set up this digital business card a little while ago and I love it because it links to my website, Facebook, email, direct contact number, location, all that. It just all there. You can click the buttons and there's a button on the bottom right.
I'm going to do it right now. just to play around. So I've got my text open. I open a new message. I put in 21000.
Correct. And then in the text box, put Yoga RX, all one word, YOGA RX, and hit send. And I have it set up to work international too, but I can't remember that.
Oh, there it is. It popped back. Priya Verma, please click to see my digital business card. I click it and we come up with the Sandalwood Yoga website. Yep. And all of your Facebook, your phone number, your Instagram, all of it. That's amazing.
It's pretty cool. So, and anyone can download that. You can go through the website and send me a message if you want to set up a 15-minute call or whatever. I know there's a lot of questions out there. I think sometimes we leave more questions than we answer.
And also keeping in mind that you have a family, a full-time job, you're doing all this DEI stuff for volunteers. So just to keep that in mind, not to ask for too much of your time.
No harm to ask. And if we need to set up, something else, we can. So I do a lot of work in clinical resiliency and in burnout. So that's been a huge focus, obviously, over the last year and a half, and launching another tier of that beyond the corporates and the medical spaces that I've been working with. And, it's the sky's the limit here with what we can do with yoga and with medicine and the interdisciplinary modeling there. So easy to reach me, easy to send a message through the portal, through a text, through an email. I'll get back at you, although it may not be right away with COVID right now, but I'll definitely reach out to anyone who's got some questions.
And in our yoga therapy program, you teach, I think, 4 or 5 community days. In January, we have History of Yoga again, which is a fascinating, mind-blowing presentation. And then I don't know if it's in February or March, but we have you coming for talks on cultural appropriation. So if you want to jump into either of those community days to hear Priya lecture, we'd love to have you.
Yeah, I think it's the history of yoga from a decolonized lens and looking at cultural appropriation, understanding what that means from a appreciation to appropriation to, our stewardship of the teachings. Scope of practice, I think we have a module that really understands what's the difference. Where's that fine line as yoga therapists, what we can and what we shouldn't be doing, having conversations about the sutras and what it is to have this mindset to come in and have difficult conversations. So, wonderful teaching workshops and collaboration with you, Amy. Just amazing opportunity to teach and work with these incredible students. I love our students. They're just amazing, amazing souls.
And you tell me when you want more, girl, because I'm going to load you up. All right. Thank you so much, Priya.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much. So glad that we had this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So thank you for listening to this conversation with Priya Verma. And I know what I came out of this conversation with was this idea that it is a very refined conversation that we're having with ourselves and with our loved ones and with our colleagues. And it's not so black and white. We have guardrails that we all need to work with, but it also requires an extreme amount of self-awareness. Where are we coming from? Are we triggered? Are we attached to our version of reality? Are we averse to someone else's version of reality? Do we have fear? Are we taking the community into consideration, not just the I, me, mine, right? The ahankara, that part of us that wants to survive and wants to be right. That idea that I'm just going to take care of me, you take care of you. We know from a yogic perspective and from Indian philosophy that that is actually not the water that we swim in, that it is assumed that we're all in this life raft together. And although we may want to row in different directions, ultimately we are in the boat together. And if we can't even hear each other, if we can't even understand each other, if we can't even be self-aware enough to say, hey, maybe my way isn't the 100% right way, or wow, I'm feeling really triggered right now, maybe I shouldn't even have this conversation, or the courage to say, I don't feel safe having this conversation with you, or being able to say, look, I want the same thing as you. I want safety, but I just have a very different strategy to get there, right? That's the goal of this. I don't know who's right, who's wrong. I don't think any of us do. And I don't think we should be so arrogant, because there's a lot of information that's going to come out that we're all going to be surprised about in the next 10 years with the after effects of COVID and starting to really understand how it spread, why it spread, what the effects are. I think it's not very humble to think that any of us has the answers, but can we at least have enough self-awareness and then self-regulation to know when to have conversations, who to have conversations with? Are we in a space where we can listen and be compassionate, even if someone has a very different version of reality? I was with my hairdresser for quite a long time last week. When you get the whole thing done, the color and the cut and all of it, it takes several hours. And she and I are completely different human beings. We're on different sides of the political spectrum. We're on different sides of the vaccine debate and the mask debate and all of it. And I still love her. Like, I know in my heart that she is a good human being doing what she feels is right for herself and her family. I cannot deny her sincerity. And I actually care about her. And we have very different views of reality. So we're trapped in this little room together for many, many hours. And thank God she's willing to mask up when she does my hair. I consider that an act of care on her part, even though she probably doesn't want to. And we had some really pointed discussions. And I was able to say, what is it that you're afraid of? And she could lay out. And I was educated by her about the things that she's worried about. I too was able to say, well, here's the things I'm worried about. And those were some aha moments for her. She's like, oh, I never thought of it that way. Right. And then she was saying, oh, it's been so politicized. And I said, well, don't you think that there's people on both sides of the political spectrum, the far left and the far right, actually have come together on this issue of vaccine hesitancy or anti-vax. And so maybe it's not political. Maybe it has been politicized by some, I might admit to that. But in the end, we are all just human beings trying to make the best decisions we can for ourselves and our family, and we have very different viewpoints. I think the only way forward is through this idea of nonviolent communication. I want to hear your needs. I want to hear your feelings. I want to hear your body sensations. I want to tell you mine. I want to do it in a nonviolent way where we can hear one another, be seen, maybe even come to some understanding, and we may still disagree. And then we can both go make our decisions. Maybe I don't want to go to that hairdresser anymore. That's a decision to be made after I engage in this kind of thoughtful, mindful conversation. Or maybe I do. Maybe I say, I'm not willing to take a ton of risks, but for this person, because I care about her and she does what I think is a great job, I'm going to keep engaging in that relationship. It's just so much self-awareness and refinement and reflection. And every decision we make, do we let our family come and stay in our home if they have a different viewpoint than us? As you heard in this podcast, I'm having to make some really, really tough decisions about our yoga therapy program and how it's going to probably it is going to stay online, not probably, it is going to stay online to accommodate the safety for all involved. And so this is the way forward. We're on the life raft together. We can argue, we can fight, we can push each other off the raft, we can row in different directions and not get anywhere, or we can look each other in the eye, be with each other heart to heart, try to understand the underlying needs that all of us have. And then after we've done that, then we can make more informed decisions with more clarity about how we want to engage, who we want to engage with, and how to move forward. So that's just my 2 cents. I would love to hear your 2 cents. We have a private Facebook group called the Yoga Therapy Hour with Amy Wheeler. We have about over 500 people in there, and you can go in there and post, what do you think about any podcast, but especially this one, if you want to start a conversation. And hopefully we will be well-behaved yogis and be able to have non-reactive conversation where feelings and needs and body sensations are heard and come to a place of connection rather than always just having to be right. All right, have a great day. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to the Yoga Therapy Hour with Amy Wheeler podcast. Another nonprofit organization that we like to support through this podcast is the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandram in Chennai, India. They are the source for the teachings of the Optimal State Yoga Therapy School, and we are so grateful. The KYM's Mitra division offers free yoga therapy training to a large number of socially and economically underprivileged children and women in Chennai. Feel free to support them through the link listed below on Red Circle. And we also have details on our website, which is also listed below. And finally, a special thank you to our team here at Optimal State. We are truly a global family. George Mantuan, one of our executive producers. Adam Satchel, senior media producer and sound engineer from the Philippines. Krishna Panchal, a producer from Canada. Modupe Abdullahi, who does the show notes and is an editor for us from Nigeria. And Peter Morley, who wrote and produced the music for this show, who lives in Australia. Find more about Peter's work at www.zenmusic.biz. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.